So today we're out at the grave of the Reverend John Scott Porter and his brother William Porter. And of course I've been inspired to make this short film by our recent visit to see Belfast City Cemetery, where this remarkable but little known monument is situated. Now, John Scott Porter was a very prominent non-subscribing Presbyterian minister in the 19th century. He was minister of First Church, a very notable scholar, a theologian, a biblical scholar, and part of a clerical dynasty that made a significant contribution, particularly to non-subscribing Presbyterianism and to the creation of the Remonstrant Synod. He did make his whole family were centrally involved with so many different aspects of non-subscribing Presbyterian life. But it is a remarkable monument and so little known. I think I had seen a picture of it before coming here, but really it was this recent visit we made to the city cemetery when we were guided around by Tom Hartley and given quite a lot of insight into these really quite forgotten and frequently quite neglected memorials. And it's interesting because how do we regard monuments such as these? How do we think about them? Well, for a long time, for decades, for many reasons, we really never thought about them at all. And one wonders what happened to such dynasties as the Porters. Well, we do know actually, but what's clear is they're not involved in our churches today. And someone like John Scott Porter, and perhaps even more curiously his brother William, are totally forgotten today. So, let's have a little look at some of the history that surrounds them. Now, John Scott Porter was born in 1801, the son of the Reverend William Porter and his wife Mary. William Porter was the Presbyterian minister in Limavady, and he is himself an interesting subject. He was in fact the clerk of the Synod of Ulster at the time of the split with the Remonstrants, with the non-subscribers, and he became the first moderator of the Remonstrant Synod of Ulster. So it's not surprising that when his son John Scott Porter entered the ministry, he naturally inclined in a non-subscribing direction. And this, of course, was before the split that came in 1830. John Scott Porter was educated at the Belfast Academical Institution, which was then a training college for ministers, and he was an exceptionally gifted student. And from Inst, he accepted a call to a pulpit in London. He became the minister of Carter Lane Chapel, a Presbyterian chapel that was situated in a narrow lane near to St. Paul's Cathedral. A long established little congregation, quite an important one, and one that was moving towards Unitarianism at the time. And it is today, the congregation continues as Unity Chapel, Islington. But at the time when he went there in 1826, it was part of what was called the Arian Party within English Presbyterianism. That is, they adopted what's described as an Arian approach to the person of Jesus. So it wasn't Trinitarian, but it wasn't as radical as the humanitarian or Socinian view that others held to. And while he was in London for 5 years, he was quite an important figure within English Presbyterianism, within this Arian party. He edited a journal called the Christian Moderator, which is actually quite hard to track down today, but it was an important little journal, partly because of the information it carried that was involved with the history of non-subscribing Presbyterianism in Ireland. There are lots of interesting things in that book, if you can ever find it. But he stayed there for 5 years and then accepted a call to First Church in Belfast as the assistant and successor to William Bruce, and as the colleague to William Bruce's son, also called William Bruce. So he came to be minister of First Church in Belfast. And he hadn't been there very long when his skills as a writer and theologian and polemicist were needed. He entered into controversy with the local Anglican minister, the Rev Daniel Bagot, and they engaged in controversy, in theological controversy, the way people did in the 1830s. There would be alternate points of view put in big public occasions, and these were later published. They were published with the title An Authentic Report of the Discussion on the Unitarian Controversy between the Reverend John Scott Porter and the Reverend Daniel Bagot, M.A., held on April 14th, 1834, and 3 following days in the meeting house of the First Presbyterian Congregation, Belfast. So this was an enormously big occasion, and the members of First Church were so pleased with their minister's performance. They're so pleased with what he said and how he handled these debates that they awarded him a gift of £1,000, which in 1834 was a lot of money. So this displays his intellectual capabilities, his theological knowledge, his ability as a preacher. And as time went on, he became more important to his liberal denomination. He became a lecturer on biblical studies and was actually appointed alongside Henry Montgomery, one of the professors for the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church. And this position was actually endowed by the government for a number of years. So he became the professor of biblical criticism and dogmatics. He was a great expert in the biblical languages, and in fact he became one of the leading experts at the time in the history of the Bible. He was one of the first theologians to develop the principles of what were called textual criticism. That is, understanding and viewing and studying the Bible from the point of view of the different versions and manuscripts which survive, and looking at the way the text is formed, instead of assuming that the Bible sort of dropped out of heaven as a single document. It looks at the texts and the variants of the text behind its construction. And he published an important book called The Principles of Textual Criticism, with their application to the Old and New Testaments in the 1840s, which was really a pioneering work in this subject. It's almost forgotten today, but at its time, it was really something quite new and quite far-reaching. Now, he was a very prominent figure as the minister of First Church in Belfast. He was an early and very strong supporter of what was called national education, which basically meant non-sectarian education free of religious controls. He's a very liberal figure in the religious life of the town. A little bit later, though, the non-subscribers ran into trouble in the 1860s. There were disagreements within the denomination of where the line should be drawn. And John Scott Porter was part of a group that split away from the Presbytery of Antrim and formed what was called the Northern Presbytery of Antrim. And this was a more conservative group than the Presbytery of Antrim. As I mentioned before, he was an Arian in his theology, and he continued with that kind of approach. And the Arians would have disputed with the more radical views that were coming from some of the others. And so he broke away and was one of the people to found the Northern Presbytery of Antrim. And they stayed separate for over 30 years. But he was part of this important family. His father was a minister. Two of his half-brothers were ministers, both interesting people that'd be worth looking at. And a sister married F.D. Finlay, the editor of the Northern Whig. Another brother, William Porter, went off to South Africa and became Attorney General of the Cape Colony and had a very important role in the history of Southern Africa before the arrival of apartheid, when he attempted to establish an electoral roll that was open to people irrespective of race. And William Porter, who died shortly after his brother John Scott Porter had come back to Belfast and was buried in the same grave as his brother. But there isn't time to look at all the members of the family, nor of John Scott Porter's own family. He had quite a number of children. Some of them are buried in the same grave as him in the city cemetery. But his eldest son was called Andrew Marshall Porter. He became Master of the Rolls in Ireland and later Attorney General. An MP, was a very important public figure. And before I mention the idea of a dynasty, well, there were so many ministers in these generations, but the subsequent generations, none of them went into the ministry. And of course, gradually, the surviving family ceased to be non-subscribers when they became, as often happened, when they became quite important public personalities. They would marry into what we might call the establishment. They would send their children to public schools, or their sons send their sons to public schools in England, and there'd be a sort of gradual accommodation into the church, the established church, and all that goes with it. And so Andrew Marshall Porter became a baronet, and the subsequent generations inherit that baronetcy. But none of them, I think, have any connection with the denomination of John Scott Porter, and indeed, I don't think any of them live in Northern Ireland. So that's an interesting thing when we reflect on this grave, on this very symbolic and impressive structure. It tells us a lot about the Victorian ideas of memorials, how people should be remembered. Now, when we went out to see this grave, I had a feeling I'd seen it before in a picture, but I can't find any pictures of it. However, what I subsequently realized is that I have seen pictures of his half-brother Classon Porter, who was minister in Laugharne, and another non-subscribing Presbyterian minister, and he's buried in the Church of Ireland graveyard in Cairncastle, but his grave looks more or less identical to that of John Scott Porter. All the sources say his grave is made of black marble, but it doesn't really look like black marble to me, but it is a very, very impressive stone. And it's important to find these places and to make connection with them and to use them as a prompt for memory for what we stand for what people in this denomination have done, and we can reflect on what is the relevant way to continue those kind of traditions in our present age. Now, John Scott Porter is not without memorials. There is a very ornate memorial to him within the First Presbyterian Church in Rosemary Street in Belfast. And he does have this very ornate and very impressive Celtic cross out in the Belfast City Cemetery. Although, like some of his books, that has been rather forgotten and overlooked. We can reflect on him, on his life and times, on the contributions he made, on the causes he espoused, on the theological controversies that he was involved with, and consider what from those things we can take for the times we live in. Well, thank you for joining in this reflection. In a few moments, Jack will play us out with the hymn, "We Limit Not the Truth of God to Our Poor Reach of Mind," played on the trumpet. And we'll close now with a prayer. Gracious Father, in darkness and in light, in trouble and in joy, help us to trust your love, to serve your purpose, and to praise your name. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.